Hello everyone, and welcome to my third video. Today I want to show you how you can use Flatfile to create fields dynamically based on a condition. Now, if you've already spent 5 minutes integrating with Flatfile, you know that one of the things you'll do is define your target sheet against which users will map their fields from the incoming file. That way, when they send data to you, it's already in the shape that your database expects. Now, in my simple use case, I have a target sheet defined that has a first name, last name, and email field. And I will also import a file that will only contain first name, last name, and email field. Now, if during the mapping stage, a user will map both first name and last name columns from their incoming file, then I want to dynamically create a full name column that will concatenate the values from the first name and last name column. If they're not going to map either of those fields, I'm not going to create that field dynamically. And that is a simple use case that we'll cover today, how you can create fields dynamically based on a certain condition. First, we'll take a look at the workflow to see how it actually looks like, and then we'll dive into the code so I can show you what exactly am I doing to make this use case possible. And then before we dive in, please remember that a public GitHub repository and all relevant Flatfile documentation will be linked at the description of this video. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's take a quick look at the user workflow. I'll import the file that is inside of the public GitHub repository that you have access to, and once that file is extracted, I'm taken to the mapping stage. Now, for this first import, I'm not going to map the first name fields. Only the last name and email fields will be mapped. In this case, the condition is not met to create a full name field dynamically. Therefore, when I click the continue button, the user will just see the normal fields that I've defined statically in my target sheet and nothing else. Now let's go ahead and delete this data from the Flatfile table, and what we're going to do is re-import that same file again, but this time we are going to map both first name and last name fields. Now, because we're mapping both first name and last name fields, the condition is met for my full name field to be created dynamically. Therefore, when I click this continue button, the Flatfile table will update with that dynamically created field. As you will see here, the full name field is now a part of the Flatfile table, and it is populated with dynamic values. Dynamic values as in it is a concatenation of the values from the first name and the last name columns. And what's more, because that condition was met, once the user is done auditing the data and they click the submit button, they will get a confirmation that the data was sent successfully to our simple database. And when we will check the response, we can indeed see that that dynamic full name column is a part of the response that we get in our simple database. So now that we know how the user workflow looks like, let's take a look at the code. You'll see on the top here, I have my Flatfile dashboard open, and on the bottom of the screen, I have my code. So the first thing I'm doing in the code is importing all the necessary packages to make sure that the code executes. And after that, I define my simple database, which in this case is a webhook site URL, and then we just save that unique URL in its own variable called webhook receiver. Now the main action is going to happen inside of this Flatfile event listener function, where you'll see I have 4 different listeners that are each responsible for their own part that we'll cover in a bit more detail. The first thing I'm doing in the code is filtering for this code to only run on the app that has app1 namespace in it. If I check my Flatfile dashboard, you will see I'm working on my app1 app. And if I click on the edit button, you will see that the namespace here matches the namespace I'm providing in the code. That is how I know that the code I have here will only execute for this app. Inside of the first listener, I'm creating a space, which you will see here. And if I open it in the separate tab, this is how it looks like. So let's see what am I doing inside of this first listener. I'm filtering it for the space configure job, which executes when a user clicks on this create new session button, or if you're embedding Flatfile inside of your web app, a new space will get created once the user clicks on that import button. Inside here, I first get the necessary information out of the event context, and then before I do anything, I acknowledge the job. The reason I first acknowledge the job before executing any of the code below is because that job can time out, especially if I'm doing a pretty heavy load as the space is being created. If I acknowledge the job first, I make sure that the job doesn't time out and finishes even if it needs a little more time to create the space successfully. Once the job is acknowledged, I execute an API call to create a workbook. I give it a name workbook1, as you can see over here in my dashboard. And then for the sheets, I'm passing it a workbook1 variable. That workbook1 variable is defined in another file, and you will see it is just a simple sheet config with 3 fields defined on it: first name, last name, and email field. I import it over here to index.ts, and I'm passing it to the sheets parameter. And then last but not least, I'm also creating a workbook level submit action. That way, when users are done auditing the data, they can click on this submit button to send the data to my sample database. So once the space is created, a workbook with its one sheet and an action is attached to that space. I then complete the job over here if all the code runs successfully. And then in case something goes wrong as the space is being created, we fail that job with a specific message to the user. The second listener executes when a workbook map job is complete. So what does that mean? That means that now that we've created a space with a workbook, a sheet, and a submit button, we can import a file to it that you can find in the public GitHub repository. And then once the file extracts, I'm taken to the mapping stage. In here, I can make decisions on which fields should be mapped. And then when I click this continue button, that is when the workbook map job starts executing. And when all the data loads in the Flatfile table, that is when the mapping job is complete. And only once it is complete, that is when we execute the code inside of the second listener. A long story short, inside of the second listener, all we're doing is creating a custom job and nothing else. So that we can create that custom job, the first thing we do is extract the necessary information out of the event context, and then we make an API call to fetch the structure of our workbook. From that workbook, we're going to filter it down to the first sheet, get its ID, and save the sheet ID as its own variable. Now that we have all the ingredients that we need, we're ready to create our custom job. We're scoping down this custom job to a sheet because over here I'm providing the mapping for the first sheet, and I want to create my full name dynamic field specifically on that sheet and not other sheets if I would have any as part of my workbook. For the operation name, I'm gonna give it dynamic API field, and you will notice that inside of the third listener, that is exactly the operation by which I'm filtering to execute the code there. For the source, we're providing the sheet ID that we extracted earlier from the workbook variable, and then we specify over here trigger immediate. The reason we specify it is because we want this custom job to execute as soon as the job ready event is reached inside of the third listener. Last but not least, inside the input parameter, I'm going to store the job ID of the mapping job where we're creating this custom job. The reason I'm doing it is because I will need to access information later about what fields a user mapped and what fields a user did not map inside of this mapping stage. And that is all that the second listener does. We're simply creating a custom job here, and once that custom job triggers inside of the third listener, that is when all the magic happens with creating a dynamic full name field if both first name and last name fields are mapped. So we do have the code to create a custom job, and that custom job will be created when the mapping job is complete. And that custom job is what will be responsible for creating that dynamic full name field. So therefore, to create the custom job, let's go ahead and trigger that mapping job inside of which it will be created. So as I go over here in the UI and I click continue, the mapping job starts, it runs, and then once it's done running, we get a success message over here. And then as the table on the background loaded, everything that took place is what is inside of the third listener. So the third listener just looked whether first name and last name fields were mapped. If they were mapped, a full name field was created with dynamic values. As we see over here, we have a full name column that has the values concatenated from the first name and the last name fields. So let's take a look inside of the third listener to see how exactly do we do that. So you'll see that I'm filtering that listener for the sheet level job with the operation name dynamic API field, which is exactly the operation name that we gave to our custom job. Before we can do anything, we first access the necessary information out of the event context, and then before we execute our custom code, as I mentioned before, we always need to make sure we acknowledge the job first, unless we're working with a job that is native to Flatfile. Now, inside of the code here, I have a couple of lines of code, but the point of it is to get to this line of code. On this line, 122, what we're doing is we're fetching the mapping job's execution plan. That execution plan will contain information on which fields were mapped and which fields were not mapped during the matching stage. So we need to see whether first name and last name fields were mapped. That is why we need that execution plan. Now, how do we get to that point that we're able to fetch the execution plan? We first get the information about our workbook and store it inside of the workbook variable. And then out of that workbook, we get information about our first sheet and also store it inside of its own variable here. Now, because we created a custom job, we will first fetch the general information about this custom job using the getJobs API call, store it inside of its own variable, and then out of that custom job, what we're going to do is retrieve the job ID, not of the custom job, but of the mapping job. When we created our custom job, remember we had a parameter input inside of which we saved the job ID for the mapping job. This is where we access it, and this is the job ID that we passed over here to fetch the execution plan for the mapping job and store it inside of the job plan. So now we have access to the information, which fields were mapped and which were not mapped. So now we're ready to actually dive into the main part of the code. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an empty array over here called mapped fields. And then we're going to do a for loop and look over the execution plan and then see which fields were mapped. And for the fields that were mapped, we're going to push them up to the mapped fields array over here. So once that for loop runs, the mapped fields array will contain the keys of the fields that were mapped during the mapping stage. Now that we have that information, we're also going to create our fields key for the dynamic fields that we're going to create. And we're going to store it inside of the dynamic full name fields key variable. We have all the ingredients now, and we can execute the if statement to see if the first name and the last name columns were mapped. We're going to create a full name field. Let's see how we do it. So inside of this if statement, which is pretty big, if you look at it, it only ends right over here. Inside of this if statement, what we're doing is we're seeing if first name field and last name fields are inside of that mapped fields array, we're going to execute the code that is inside of that if statement. Now that code goes as follows. The first thing we do is we make an API call to add a field to our sheet that will contain the key that we just saved over here. We're going to give it a label full name, as you can see over here in the UI, and we're going to define it as type string. After that, we're going to define the page number over here and create a while loop. Inside of this while loop, what we're doing is fetching all the information from the sheet and seeing that as long as the page gets returned, we're going to continue to create those dynamic values for the full name field column. That way, in my case, I'm only uploading a data that has 100 rows in it. Now, if you're importing a file that has 100,000 rows in it, then this while loop will really help because it paginates through the pages of data and then it populates the full name field with those concatenated values from the first name and the last name field. All of that is happening over here, and then once the while loop can no longer find a new page of records to loop over, the while loop ends and all the values are populated in the full name field. How do we do that? How do we populate those values inside of the full name field? Over here, we're going to declare the update records variable, and inside of it, what we're doing is we're first fetching values for each record, and then we're going to populate the values for our dynamic field with the values of the first name field, separated by a space, and the values of the last name fields. And last but not least, we're going to return that information, and that is how the values inside of the full name field are populated. For everything to take effect, we make one last API records update call that goes over each record and updates it to make sure that we have the data over here that we expect to see. That is the end of the if statement here. So if both first name and last name fields are mapped, all of that logic is going to be ran. If either first name or last name fields were not mapped, that if statement will be completely skipped. Either way, whether first name or last name fields were mapped or not, at this point in the code, we have done everything that we need that custom job to do. So the last thing for us that is left is to complete the job with a message to the user, table update complete, please audit the data. If you noticed, once the Flatfile table updated, a model popped up that a user had to acknowledge, and it contained that text, table update complete, please audit the data, and I set that to acknowledge true so that a user had to click the continue button in order to audit the data. If everything goes well, we complete this job. If something goes wrong, we fail the job with a specific message. So that is how we create the full name field dynamically based on the fact if first name or last name columns were populated, and inside of that listener, we've also created dynamic values for that field that concatenates the values from the first name and the last name fields. The last thing I'm going to show you is when we submit the data over here, that is when the fourth and the last listener will execute. Let's take a look at it. It is a pretty simple listener. So over here, I'm filtering for the job workbook submit action that I created earlier. And then over here, we get all the necessary information out of the event context. We acknowledge the job. And after that, we first list all the sheets that are part of our workbook. Then we create an empty records array that is later going to store all the records that are inside of the sheets that I'm trying to submit. As you can see over here, we're looping over each sheet. We're making an API get records call to get all the records, and we push them up to the records variable that now contains the information about each sheet and all the rows that we're submitting. Once we have all that information, we execute a post Axios call to our sample database, which in this case is a webhook receiver that we defined at the very top of the code. And once the data is sent, we're going to either complete the job if the submit action was successful, and if something doesn't execute well, we're going to fail the job. So let's see how that looks like. When I click on the submit button, the code executes, all the rows are being sent to my sample database, and I get a success message here. If we check the webhook site response that we just received, we can see that indeed the full name column that we dynamically created is a part of the response. So you're not only creating a dynamic field based on a condition, but you also get it when a user clicks on the submit button. This wraps up my third video. Thank you so much for watching it. I know it was a lot of content, but I did want to make sure that I go into the details. That way, by the end of this video, everything is clear to you and you don't have any major questions remaining. As always, please remember that the public GitHub repository with all the code, the example file, and all the relevant Flatfile documentation is available to you in the description of this video. If you do enjoy the content, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It'll really help me, especially now as I'm starting off. And then please, if you have any feedback for the content I'm doing, or if you have requests for the future content for me to work on, please leave that in the comment section of the video and I will make sure to look at it. Thanks a lot for your time, and I'll see you soon.